Hello, I hope you're well. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is all about World War II fiction recommendations. Now, I'm the first person to acknowledge the fact that there is a serious glut when it comes to World War II historical fiction. I am also the same person who time and time again says that it should basically be its own subgenre at this point. But I am still a sucker for those stories. It happens to be a time period that even when I'm reading nonfiction, I'm particularly drawn to. But I'm drawn to, outstanding World War II historical fiction, and I think that's the difference. There is a lot of just mediocre World War II fiction out there that is very, very predictable, to the point that you kind of see the same tropes of star-crossed lovers from opposite sides of the war falling in love when they shouldn't, the same sort of conflicts and situations, a lot of the times very, very similar settings, and it can get boring, I'm not gonna lie, but when you find a really good World War II fiction, it's like chef's kiss. And so the books that I'm talking about today, I have 5, and then one that I wanted to kind of give an honorable mention to. These are books that I just felt were offering something unique to the World War II setting, and books that I rated really highly when I read them. So with all that preamble, why don't we just dive right in? The first book that I want to talk about is Sweet Franchez by Irene Nemirovsky, and this book is the sole reason that this list cannot be considered just historical fiction, because this isn't historical fiction. So Irene Nemirovsky was a Jewish woman living in Paris who was already an established author at the time that the Germans were occupying France, and she is writing this as she is experiencing and witnessing the occupation. So really, this is one of the earliest examples of World War II fiction, which I think is just really, really cool about it. But one of the things that I admire is the fact that Irene Nemirovsky, as she's living through this, is able to provide such an insightful, reflective look at human nature. So the book is kind of divided into 2 parts. The first is this group of individuals are trying to flee Paris, and they're kind of thrown together by fate because they're all trying to escape at the same time. And there are a lot of interconnected stories here, and a lot of it is just about missteps and human folly, and if I want to go kind of woo the human condition. And then the second part of the book is really focused on this one town, Bussy. It's very provincial in France, and the town reacting to the German soldiers being billeted in their homes while a lot of their own men are off at war, and the main character is actually the wife of a prisoner of war who is living with her mother-in-law, and they have to take on a German officer in their home because they have one of the better homes in this village because they're more well-to-do. And that too, when they're talking about the interaction of these villagers with the Germans, just blew my mind, because a lot of the time, yeah, there's this antagonism, but you also see that friendships and things were able to form between these individuals, which just felt so different for me. But yeah, the writing is stunning, and fun fact about this is that it is not a completed manuscript, and it's also a first draft. So the fact that the writing and the complexity of the stories and the characters is already there, I could only imagine what would have happened if this had been completed and if it had gone through multiple revisions with Irene. Unfortunately, Irene was deported to Auschwitz and ended up dying during in the Holocaust. So it was not completed, and the book itself ended up being hidden for years and years before it finally was published. But if you want kind of one of the earliest forms of World War II fiction, I would highly recommend it. If you're looking for translated works, I would also highly recommend it. But yeah, it's just one of those really rich stories with compelling characters, and it was just really, really good. Like, really, really good. I became such a fan of this author after reading it. But yeah, I haven't stopped thinking about this since I read it, so alrighty. So the next book is one that I've spoken about countless times on this channel, so I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record, but it is one of my favorite books of all time, and that is The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje. Now, this book is not going to be for everyone. Like, this is definitely a Marmite choice for this list, because I would say it's arguably one of the more literary options on this list. It is very character driven, it is a fairly slow pace, and I would argue somewhat experimental, but the writing for me is stunning. Like, this is a book that the writing, I still have dreams about it. Like, I can still pick out passages from it, and they just left an impression on me. And kind of similar to Sweet Francaise, where these characters who probably would never have had much interaction in their life if not for the war, you have 4 characters here that are thrown together at the end of the war into this Italian villa during the Italian campaign. You have a nurse who's taking care of this dying burn victim, the English patient of the title. You have this Indian sapper who is literally going around the Italian countryside and trying to defuse these bombs to make the movements of the troops safer, but also make the quality of life better for the Italians who live there and have lived there. So you have those characters. You also have this thief that kind of enters the picture as well. And it's just one of those books that the characters themselves are so rich and their backstories are so lush and interesting, and just everything about them just is beautiful to me. Like, they are just so well formed, like fleshed out and human, and they have their flaws and they have their passions and they have their like stories, which in most cases are not the happiest stories on the planet, but the cast of characters for me is just phenomenal. And I think one of the things that I also really liked about this book, in addition to the characters, in addition to the gorgeous writing, is the fact that although a lot of this book is set during World War II, which is the present within this book, some of it is also set before the war in Egypt. And so you're seeing and watching the sort of paranoia and that level of distrust and suspicion kind of bubble up as the different nationalities that are in Egypt at that time, the different countries that are represented, are really bracing themselves for war. And the setting just felt very unique to me. The desert in this book is a big, like, I guess, theme. It's very symbolic. There are some of the most stunning passages about it. And speaking about stunning, you couldn't really have a historical fiction World War II style without a romance. And the romance in this book is one of the most sensual, passionate, and probably the most erotic romances that I've ever read without getting smutty, if that makes sense. And so this book, although it's fairly short, it is not 300 pages, there's just a lot in here. It is a book that you need to put a little bit of work into. I wouldn't say that it's the easiest read on the planet because of the more literary style of writing and the more experimental elements of it, but it is well worth it for the characters, the writing, and just everything, in my opinion. So yeah, I'm gonna stop gushing about this book because I've gushed about it countless times on this channel already, but yeah, this is just lovely. The next book is The Night Watch by Sarah Waters, and yes to everything about this book. I had already read a couple books by Sarah Waters by the time I got to this one, and it captured the same atmosphere, the same sort of shock and awe of these plot twists that I always talk about. The characters are super rich, and it's just great fun. But this just felt like such a breath of fresh air when it came to World War II historical fiction because of the characters themselves and because of how the book is written. So this book actually goes backwards in time during the 1940s. So it starts in 1947, then it jumps backwards to 1944, and then it jumps backwards again to 1941. And with each leap back in time, you're slowly unwrapping or unfurling the connections between the main characters and how their lives actually intersect. This book to me just felt so unique when it came to World War II historical fiction because of its characters. Like many of Sarah Waters' books, potentially all of them, there are LGBTQ plus characters, and so in this book you actually have a number of like sapphic romances and relationships that you're exploring during this time, so you're getting a glimpse into what the LGBTQ plus community would have been like during the war. So you have these really unique takes on humans and people living during the war and going about their day-to-day lives, and kind of the surprise and intrigue of finding out how all of these lives are connected as you go back in time. But also, this is one of these books that the realism of like the characters living through the Blitz in London was so much to the point that you could almost smell the sulfur, in my opinion. Like, what these characters are witnessing, what they're living through, the fear, the anxiety, the courage, the just like everything about it just felt so real to me. And so I can never praise Sarah Waters' books highly enough, in my opinion, but this is by far one of the more unique historical fiction novels that I have read about World War II for all of those reasons I listed. So if you are looking for more LGBTQ plus representation in books, if you like kind of gothic tones and undertones, I would highly recommend it because you're getting all of that with a World War II story. But yeah, this book, amazing, as were all of the books that I've talked about so far. The next book is one that I feel like had to be on this list, and I don't know if you could have a World War II list without it, and that is Ian McEwan's Atonement. And again, this is not going to be a book for everyone because it is written in a stream of consciousness, which most people either love it or hate it. There's very rarely kind of a middle ground with it. It's also very character driven, which is something I personally really enjoy. And it's, I would consider it more like literary or highfalutin in that sort of way. But again, it's just a beautifully written book with a really compelling story. I think most people know the general concept of the story because of the Keira Knightley movie that came out sometime in the 2000s, but essentially it's just before the war when this book starts. Everyone is kind of preparing themselves for it, but these individuals are at this like country home in England during the summer. There's going to be a dinner party, and Bryony, this young, very, very precocious girl, thinks she sees something, but really misunderstands what she's seeing of adults' interactions and behaviors. But she accuses someone, Robbie, of a crime, and it ends up having these really harsh repercussions for the characters involved. And so the second half of the book is actually in World War II, where you've seen kind of the fallout of what happened from that fateful night. And in the case of Robbie, he is at Dunkirk, I believe, and he is trying to get to the coast where all of the British troops are trying to get so that they can be evacuated, and you're literally following him on the track, and in that way it reminds me of that movie 1917 where you're following those soldiers as they try to get, I think, to the front to deliver a message. Like, there's something about the way it's written that reminds me very much of that, and in the same way, it also very much reminded me of the movie Dunkirk, because of the sort of scenes and situations that Robbie experiences and witnesses. And the realism again here is just uncanny. Like, you feel it, you live it, and that's one of the most powerful aspects of, I think, the World War II portions of the book, because even when you're dealing with the character of Bryony, who is a nurse in London, and she's dealing with these wounded soldiers who are being brought back from the front, the realism of her working under this matron and taking care of these soldiers, and her disgust and horror, her sadness, all of the things she's feeling, everything that's being described, just feels so, so real. It's just one of those books that the story is really compelling. The characters are all flawed, I would say. Like, none of them are perfect, which is what I like in my characters. I like slightly damaged or flawed characters, which is probably a recurring theme with basically all the books on this list. But it's just the nuances of the characters, the way they think, and the way that that's all put before you is just incredible to me. So again, not a book that everyone's gonna like if they are very opposed to stream of consciousness, but if not, I would say give it a try. But yeah, this is just like a World War II historical fiction classic, so I had to include it on the list. The next book is City of Women by David R. Gillham, and this is one of these books that I read it so many years ago, but I still have very fond memories of the reading experience, even if like plot details are a little bit fuzzy. This is a book that I've recommended to countless people. I think my copy is currently with my aunt, but this book was a true page turner to me with a lot of suspenseful elements to it. So it's called City of Women because it's set in Berlin, and during the war, for the most part, all the men are gone. They're at the front, and you're just left with a bunch of women, children, and like old men. And the character Sigrid, I believe her name is what you would expect of like the ideal German wife, the Hausfrau, and that's just kind of the surface level, because there's all this other stuff going on with this character and her interactions with all of the other characters. There's just a lot. Like I said, there's a lot of suspense, a lot of things going on, and it just kept me really, really intrigued. But I do think one of the like strengths in the book is creating this setting, because the way that it kind of depicts the Germans in Berlin, like the civilians, and how they're living their lives and what their expectations of what the outcome of the war will be, like how they're dealing with the dangers and the threat of war, is really interesting and unique to me, because I feel like a lot of the World War II historical fiction focuses on the Allied forces. There's far fewer historical fiction novels that I know of that have main characters who are German, and not German Jewish, but German, and also are living in Berlin during the war. So there was something very novel about it, and I just really had a good time with it. As I said, there are some aspects of this book that are really kind of fuzzy, but I think if you like the suspense elements, if you want something that is kind of a quicker read, that this is a book that might be a little bit more up your alley. But yeah, I have recommended this book to countless people over the years, and it's just great. It was so different for me, and yeah, that's all I'm going to say on that one. The last book is more of an honorable mention, but it is City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert, and the reason it's more of an honorable mention than being included on the list is because I would argue that there's a fair bit of this book that is not set during World War II. It's either set before the war or after the war. But there is a section that is World War II focused. But I just had a fun time with this book. It is long, it is a thick boy, but the characters are just so flamboyant and so colorful, and it really was just a fun time. So the idea of the book, the premise, is that the main character Vivian is in her, I believe, 80s, and she's basically recounting her life story from the time that she arrives in New York City after her parents have sent her there to live with her aunt, basically through a good chunk of her life. And that part of it is a little bit gimmicky because, as I mentioned, this is a thick book, so you have to wonder, how long is this letter that Vivian is supposedly writing that is recounting her life story? Because it's basically like she's written a letter that is the length of War and Peace. But if you kind of suspend disbelief and just accept that and just enjoy the story, it is just fun. So Vivian ended up living with her aunt in New York City, and her aunt runs this theater, and so Vivian is coming into contact with showgirls and musicians and just show business people who are really just larger than life, and that is very much how Peg is as well. And this is a girl who, although she's a bit of a rebel, has been fairly sheltered, and these showgirls take her under her wing and let her explore her sexuality and are very encouraging of it. They take her out partying, and just she lives it up as you would expect a 20-something-year-old to do when they're away from their parents. But once you actually get to World War II in this book, it's really interesting to me because, again, this is a setting that felt very different. A lot of the World War II historical fiction or fiction that I've read is set in Europe, but this is set in New York, which New York didn't really get involved in the conflict itself, other than you would have been dealing with sending soldiers overseas or having an influx of soldiers into the city, or kind of doing all the stuff that you would need to on the home front to support the war effort. And that is what Vivian ends up doing. But because of that, you're seeing life as it would have been for people that were not directly involved in the conflict, because they weren't in Europe or in the Pacific or where the fighting was taking place. And again, I'm a New Yorker, so seeing or getting a glimpse of what like World War II New York City would have been like was really intriguing to me. But again, this is a book that for me, the characters stole the show, and I just really had a fun time with it, like genuinely. I listened to the audiobook with it and thought it was fabulous. It just is a long audiobook because it is a long book, but this book I slept on for so long before I actually picked it up, and so if you're sleeping on it still, I would recommend it, because this one, like, yeah, there's World War II in it, but I could see people arguing that it's not World War II historical fiction as well. So you might squeak by if you're really adverse to World War II in your fiction. But yeah, those would be my World War II fiction recommendations. I've really tried to select books that have like a fresh take on what could be a very stale subject because of just how many World War II books are out there at this point, but I do really think that these are some of the most interesting characters and compelling stories out there, and I just obviously really enjoyed them when I read them. So if you've read any of these, certainly let me know in the comments, or if you're adding any of them to your own TBR. But as always, thank you so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, be sure to give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye!